8 years. The number was a stone in her gut, a constant, weighty presence. 8 years since a sound had passed her lips. 8 years of curated silence, a fortress-built note by stolen note against a fate she refused to accept. Elara smoothed the frayed edge of an ancient tapestry, her fingers tracing the faded gold thread of a long-dead queen's gown. Here, in the quiet solitude of the mending room, the silence was a comfort, a familiar cloak. But outside this chamber, it was armor. Heavy, cumbersome, but the only thing that had kept her safe. The castle vibrated with a low thrum of anticipation. He was returning. Alpha King Rysender. The name alone was enough to make the breath catch in her throat, a reflexive tightening of every muscle. She had not seen him in 6 months, a blessed reprieve while he toured the northern territories. 6 months where the air felt lighter, where she could almost pretend she was just a simple seamstress, forgotten and invisible. But his return meant the pressure would resume, a constant, low-grade terror that lived just beneath her skin. She felt the shift before she heard it. A change in the castle's very atmosphere, as if the stone and mortar themselves were drawing a collective breath. The distant cheer from the courtyard was a herald, but the true signal was the prickling awareness along her spine, a primal instinct she had spent nearly a decade trying to kill. The wolf inside her, the one she kept starved and chained in the deepest dungeon of her soul, stirred. It lifted its head, scenting the air. Mate. Elara's fingers clenched on the tapestry, the rough fibers digging into her skin. No. The word was a silent scream in her mind, a prayer and a command. She forced the sensation down, burying it under layers of practiced emptiness. She was Elara, the mute girl who mended linens. That was all. She had no wolf. She had no mate. She had given up her voice to ensure it. The claim was a song of possession, a gilded cage presented as a divine gift. She had watched it destroy her aunt, a vibrant, laughing woman who had been claimed by a lord who saw her not as a partner, but as a beautiful, breathing trophy. Her aunt's light had dimmed, her will eroded by the overwhelming force of the bond, until she was nothing more than an echo of the man she was bound to. Elara had been 12 when her aunt died, a faded whisper of a woman, and on that day, Elara had made a vow. She would never be an echo. She would rather be silence. So she had silenced herself. When the first signs of her own powerful lineage had surfaced, the faint, shimmering pull toward the unmated alphas at court, she had severed the most vital part of her connection to the world. A wolf's power was in its call, its voice, its howl that answered another's. Without a voice, she was a broken thing, incomplete, unclaimable. The theory had been a desperate gamble, born of a child's fear, but for 8 years, it had worked. She was overlooked, pitted, and, most importantly, left alone. A bell chimed, signaling the evening meal preparations. Her duty. She folded the tapestry with precise, careful movements, her composure a mask she never let slip. Her heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs, but her hands were steady. Her face, she knew, was serene. Dignity was the last weapon she possessed. She moved through the bustling kitchens, a ghost in a simple gray dress. The scents of roasting meat and baking bread were thick in the air, but the only scent she could truly register was the one that had just entered the castle walls, pine and cold winter air and something else, something uniquely him. It was a scent that promised both ruin and a terrifying, treacherous comfort. Her task was to serve the high table, a position of honor that felt like a punishment. It meant proximity. It meant being under his gaze. She picked up the heavy silver pitcher of wine, the metal cool against her trembling palms. Steady. She walked toward the great hall, each step a deliberate act of will. The great hall was a cavern of noise and light, a stark contrast to her internal world. Banners hung from the rafters, and the fire in the grand hearth roared, casting flickering shadows that danced like specters. And there he was. He stood by the fire, speaking to his beta. He was taller than she remembered, broader in the shoulder. The firelight caught the silver threads in his dark hair and glinted off the simple circlet on his brow. He was not handsome in the way of courtly princes. His face was all harsh lines and sharp angles, carved by duty and war. But it was his eyes that held the true power. They were the color of a stormy sea, and they missed nothing. As if feeling her scrutiny, his head turned. His gaze swept the hall, dismissive, assessing, until it landed on her. And stopped. For a single, eternal second, the world fell away. The noise, the heat, the 100 other people in the hall, they all vanished. There was only the weight of his gaze. It was not a look of recognition, not yet. It was something more unnerving. It was curiosity. A hunter's focus on something that didn't quite fit the landscape. Her heart hammered a frantic, traitorous rhythm against her ribs. The wolf within her whined, a low, aching sound only she could hear. It wanted to answer the silent call in his eyes. It wanted to break free. Elara lowered her head, the heavy fall of her hair a curtain between them, and forced her feet to move. She approached the table, her movements fluid and silent, the way she'd practiced for thousands of days. She was a shadow, a servant, nothing more. She began to pour the wine, her focus narrowed to the stream of dark liquid, the rim of the goblet, anything but the man whose presence was a physical force against her skin. 8 years. It felt like a lifetime. But as she stood there, just feet from him, she had the terrible, sinking feeling that her time was running out. Days bled into a week, and a tense rhythm established itself. Elara moved through her duties with the quiet grace of a wraith, ever conscious of the king's eyes upon her. He did not seek her out, not directly, but she felt his awareness. It was in the way his conversations would pause for a fraction of a second when she entered a room to stoke the fire, or the way his gaze would drift to her hands as she cleared his plate. He was watching, studying, and with every passing day, her armor of silence felt thinner, more brittle. The near miss came on a rain-slicked afternoon. She was carrying a stack of freshly mended tunics, the clean scent of lye and lavender a small comfort, when she turned a corner too quickly and collided with Lord Valerius, one of the king's most arrogant and ill-tempered cousins. The stack of linens tumbled into a muddy puddle. Valerius sneered, his lip curling. "Clumsy wretch. Look what you've done." His voice was a whip crack in the quiet corridor. "These are for the king's personal guard." Elara immediately dropped to her knees, her hands hovering over the soiled fabric. A hot shame washed over her, but her face remained a placid mask. She bowed her head in apology, her hands moving in the simple, formal gesture of contrition she had been taught. "An apology? From a mute? What good is that?" he scoffed, nudging the wet pile with the toe of his expensive boot. "You are useless. Less than useless. My hound has more sense." Each word was a small, sharp stone. She was used to condescension, to pity, but the overt cruelty still found its mark. She began to gather the ruined tunics, her knuckles white. There was nothing to be done but endure it. This was the price of her safety. "That is enough, Valerius." The voice was low, resonant, and cut through the damp air like a blade. King Rysandr stood at the end of the corridor, his arms crossed over his chest. He had moved as silently as a predator, and neither of them had heard his approach. The scent of pine and rain intensified, overwhelming her senses. Valerius stiffened, his arrogant posture dissolving. "Your Majesty, I was just reprimanding this servant." She was careless. Rysandr's stormy eyes did not look at his cousin. They were fixed on Elara, kneeling in the mud. He saw the soiled linens, her bowed head, the rigid set of her shoulders. A muscle feathered in his jaw. "She is a servant of this household, under my protection. As are you. I expect you to remember that." His tone was quiet, yet it held an unmistakable threat. Valerius paled. "Of course, Your Majesty." "My apologies." He offered a stiff bow and retreated, casting one last venomous glare in Elara's direction. Silence descended. It was just the two of them, the rain drumming a soft rhythm on the stones outside. Elara remained on her knees, trapped. To stand felt like a defiance, to stay felt like an invitation for more scrutiny. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. This was worse than the scorn. This kindness, this defense, was a danger she was not equipped to handle. It made the chained wolf inside her pace, testing its bonds. "Stand up," he said. It was not a command so much as a gentle request. Slowly, agonizingly, she rose. She kept her eyes downcast, fixed on the muddy hem of her dress. She could feel his proximity, the warmth radiating from his body. She prayed he would leave, dismiss her, forget her. Instead, he took a step closer. Her breath hitched. He bent down and picked up one of the soiled tunics, his large, calloused hand surprisingly gentle with the fabric. "This can be cleaned," he looked at her, and she was forced to meet his gaze. "There is no permanent damage." He was speaking of the tunic, but the words echoed in the space between them, taking on a different meaning. He was looking at her as if he could see the damage within, the parts of her she had locked away. In his eyes, she saw not pity, but a flicker of something else. Understanding. It was too much. A tiny, treacherous bud of hope tried to unfurl in the barren wasteland of her heart. Hope that he was not like the others. Hope that he saw her. She crushed it without mercy. Hope was a fool's game. Hope was what had killed her aunt. She gave him a short, deferential bow, took the tunic from his hand, her fingers brushing his for a searing, electric moment, and gathered the rest of the pile. Without a backward glance, she turned and fled, her composure cracking with every step. She did not stop until she was back in the mending room, the door bolted behind her. She sank to the floor, the muddy clothes forgotten in her lap, and finally let the tremors shake her. His kindness was a chisel against her fortress walls, and she feared they were not nearly as strong as she had believed. The incident in the corridor marked a definitive shift. Before, his attention had been a passive, ambient thing. Now it was active. It was intent. Alara felt it like a constant pressure at the base of her skull. When she served at the high table, she could feel his gaze tracing the line of her neck. When she passed him in the halls, his steps would slow almost imperceptibly, as if waiting for something. A sign. A sound. He began to create reasons for her to be near. A tear in his ceremonial cloak that required immediate, delicate attention. A collection of antique maps whose brittle edges needed reinforcing with silk thread, a task he insisted be done only in the quiet of his private study while he worked. Each summons was a new form of torture. She would sit in the corner of his study, the scent of old parchment and his own wintry presence filling the air, and work with her needle. The silence in the room was profound, broken only by the scratch of his quill and the soft whisper of her thread passing through fabric. He would not speak to her for hours, yet his awareness of her was a palpable thing. It wrapped around her, heavy and warm like a wool blanket, and she fought the urge to either flee from it or sink into it. One evening, as she worked on the hem of a banner, he finally spoke into the quiet. "They say you have not spoken a word in 8 years." Alara's needle froze mid-stitch. Her blood ran cold. She did not look up, praying that if she ignored him, he would drop it. He did not. "They say a fever took your voice when you were a girl," he continued, his voice a low, thoughtful rumble. "A terrible pity. Your file says you came to the capital from the southern provinces. From Oakhaven." Oakhaven. The name was a ghost on her tongue. It was the last place she had been herself. It was where her aunt had withered. A memory, sharp and unwanted, pierced through her defenses, her 12-year-old self, hiding behind a curtain, watching her aunt stare blankly out a window. Her claimed lord, her mate, was across the room, laughing with his friends, utterly oblivious to the light he had extinguished. He had not been cruel, not in the way Valerius was. He had simply been overwhelming. His presence, his emotions, his very life force had flooded the bond between them, drowning her aunt's identity until she was nothing but a reflection of his. That was the claim's secret horror, not cruelty, but erasure. Rysender had stopped writing. She could feel him watching her, waiting for a reaction. She forced her hand to move, to complete the stitch. The movement was stiff, jerky. But fevers do not leave a person with such control, he mused, almost to himself. They do not leave behind eyes that understand every word, that hold entire conversations without making a sound. They do not leave behind a wolf that howls so loudly in the silence. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. He knows. The thought was a shard of ice in her chest. Not everything, but he knew the silence was a lie. Her inner wolf, the one she had starved and beaten into submission, threw itself against its chains, recognizing the Alpha's challenge. It wanted to answer him, to howl its pain and loneliness and rage. She fought it down, a wave of nausea rolling through her. She kept her head bowed, her hair hiding her face. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the banner. Say nothing. Do nothing. Be nothing. He sighed, a soft, frustrated sound. I do not know what you are hiding from, Alara, he said, and the sound of her name, spoken so softly in his voice, was a physical blow. But the shadows you are living in will not protect you forever. Sometimes, the only way out is through. He said nothing more that night. But the battle lines had been drawn. He was no longer just watching, he was hunting. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that he was hunting for her voice. The summons came late. A page, barely a boy, found her in the deserted mending room, his eyes wide with the importance of his message. The king requires you. In his study. The words hung in the air, a death sentence. It was well past midnight. The castle was asleep, draped in shadow and silence. This was not a request for mending. This was a confrontation. The final one. Her heart began a slow, heavy drumbeat of dread. She could refuse. Feign illness. But that would only delay the inevitable and show her fear. Her only defense was the one she had held for 8 years, the armor of serene, silent obedience. She nodded to the page, her face a calm, placid mask that belied the screaming panic in her soul. The walk to his study was the longest of her life. Every torch sconce seemed to cast a judging light, every shadow seemed to writhe with accusation. The wolf inside her was pacing, a frantic, desperate energy building with every step she took toward him. It knew, as she did, that this was the end of the hunt. She paused outside the heavy oak door, one hand pressed to her chest as if she could physically hold her treacherous heart in place. Dignity, she reminded herself. It was all she had left. She pushed the door open. The room was lit only by a dying fire in the hearth. Rysander stood by the window, his back to her, looking out at the moon-drenched courtyard. He was not in his royal finery, but a simple dark tunic and trousers, making him seem both more approachable and more dangerous. The air was thick with unspoken tension. She closed the door behind her, the soft click echoing in the stillness. She waited. He turned slowly. His face was cast in shadow, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, his stormy eyes seeming to see right through her skin, past the bone, and into the terrified heart of her. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice quiet, intimate in the small space. He gestured to a small, intricate tapestry hanging on the wall near the fireplace. It depicted a lone white wolf howling at a silver moon. "This was my mother's. The thread work at the base is coming undone." It was a pretense, and they both knew it. But she played her part, moving toward the tapestry, her mind racing. She ran her fingers over the loose threads, her touch clinical, assessing. It was a simple repair. It did not require a midnight summons. "I have been king for 10 years, Rysander said, his voice coming from directly behind her. She hadn't heard him move. He was so close she could feel the heat of his body, smell the sharp, clean scent of winter on his clothes. Her breath caught. "In that time, I have learned to read people, to see the truth behind the masks they wear. And your mask, Alara, is the most elaborate I have ever seen." She kept her back to him, her shoulders rigid. Her entire being was focused on the single point of contact where a loose thread from the tapestry brushed against her knuckle. "I feel it," he murmured, his voice so low it was almost a vibration against her skin. A pull. A connection. Faint, suppressed, but there. The echo of a song with no singer. He paused. "You are not mute." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Alara squeezed her eyes shut. The fortress was crumbling. The walls were coming down. 8 years of silence, of rigid control, of self-denial, all unraveling because of this one man's perception. "What are you so afraid of?" he asked, his voice laced with a genuine, aching curiosity. "What could be so terrible that you would rip out your own tongue, metaphorically speaking, to escape it?" She could not answer. Would not. The vow was all that held her together. He moved then, coming to stand beside her. She flinched as he reached out, not to touch her, but the tapestry. His fingers brushed against hers as he traced the form of the howling wolf. A jolt, white-hot and electric, shot up her arm, straight to her core. The claim. Raw, undeniable, and terrifyingly powerful. It was the feeling she had dedicated her life to avoiding, and it was more potent than she had ever imagined. The wolf inside her threw its head back and howled, a sound of pure, unrestrained agony and longing that exploded in the confines of her mind. "There," Rysender whispered, his eyes locked on her face, watching the storm of emotions she could no longer hide. "There you are." He reached for her then, his hand moving with excruciating slowness. He didn't grab her. He simply cupped her jaw, his thumb stroking the sensitive skin just below her ear. The touch was gentle, reverent, and it shattered the last of her control. A tear escaped, tracing a hot path down her cold cheek. "Stop hiding from me," he pleaded, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. "I have been searching for you my entire life. Don't make me find you only to lose you to a ghost." His thumb brushed over her lips. They tingled, burned. He was asking for her voice. He was asking for the one thing she had sworn never to give. To speak was to accept the bond. To accept the bond was to be erased. But looking into his eyes, she saw none of the possessive fire she'd seen in her uncle by marriage. She saw patience. She saw loneliness that mirrored her own. She saw a king who was just a man, searching for his other half. A war raged within her. 8 years of fear against a lifetime of longing. The instinct to survive against the instinct to connect. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "Please," he breathed, the word a ghost against her mouth. And something inside her broke. A dam holding back a flood of unspoken words, of silent screams, of lonely years. A sound clawed its way up her throat, rusty and unused. It was not a word. It was a gasp, a choked, desperate intake of breath that was louder than any shout. His eyes widened in shock, in triumph. And then a single word, torn from the depths of her soul, escaped her lips. A word she hadn't spoken in 8 years. A word that was both a surrender and a beginning. "No." The sound was a raw, broken whisper, foreign and painful. It hung in the air between them, a fragile, impossible thing. And in the sudden, ringing silence that followed, Elara knew that nothing would ever be the same. The silence was broken, and she was utterly, terrifyingly free.